You probably don't think about it much. But imagine being stuck at sea, no land in sight, and the sun blaring down on you. Now, picture that you have barely a drop of fresh water left. Sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? For pirates, this was reality. Out there on
We
the
have a
open
deal!
ocean,
Aye,
thirst
aye, a
wasn't
deal
just
it is!
uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. Fresh water wasn't something you could just grab from the nearest convenience
Flesh!
store or pump out of a bottle. It was more valuable than gold. And the thing is, pirates didn't have bottled water or fancy tanks. They were working with barrels, which, as you can imagine, didn't exactly keep water fresh for long. So, the battle for water was real. Now, I'm sure we've all been parched at some point. You know that feeling, your throat's dry, your mouth feels like a desert, and all you can think about is getting that first sip. But for pirates, this wasn't just an annoyance. If they didn't find a solution, it was a one-way ticket to death's door. Back in the day, ships weren't the luxury cruise liners we're used to seeing in the movies. No, pirate ships were basically wooden rafts with cannons. They had to pack enough water for long voyages. But the catch? There wasn't a ton of space on board, and they had to make tough choices about what to bring along. Trading goods, weapons, rum, everything was essential. Water, though, it was a game of survival. But just to rub salt in the wound, the water they did have didn't stay fresh. I mean, we're talking about wood, saltwater spray, and a few months of sweltering heat. If you've ever had a sip of water from an old wooden barrel, you know it doesn't taste like anything you'd want to drink. It's bad enough that they were sweating buckets, their skin burning from the sun, but they also had to deal with the gnawing thirst that came with it. And this wasn't just a pirate problem. Anyone who sailed back in the day faced this issue. But for pirates, it was especially dire. Their whole way of life depended on being tough, adaptable, and always ready to fight not just the enemy, but nature itself. So, what do you do when you're parched beyond belief, stuck in the middle of the ocean, and there's water everywhere? I mean, you think the answer is obvious, just drink the ocean water, right? Wrong. Seawater, despite being all around you, is a pirate's worst enemy. Let me tell you why. Imagine this. You're thirsty, your throat feels like sandpaper, and you think, what harm could the little seawater do? The pirates tried it, thinking it would quench their thirst. The result? They learned the hard way that seawater is a one-way ticket to disaster. You see, drinking seawater isn't like drinking the refreshing water from a lake or river. It's full of salt, about 3 times more than your body can process. And if you drink too much, your kidneys can't handle it. You'll start feeling more thirsty as your body desperately tries to get rid of all that salt. In fact, drinking seawater makes you thirstier, which sets up this vicious cycle where your body breaks down. I mean, imagine being stuck at sea, already desperate, and then making the decision to drink that salty water. What's worse is that pirates, in their ignorance, didn't know the full effect of salt water until it was too late. They'd start feeling the cramps, the nausea, and the diarrhea that followed. And you know what else? Pirates, like any good adventurer, started hallucinating. They look out at the horizon, convinced they could see freshwater springs shimmering. But, of course, that was just their body falling apart. The dehydration was making them see things, and the reality of their situation hit hard. It wasn't until many sailors perished from the effects of seawater consumption that the word spread. Don't drink the salt water. By then, though, many had already suffered, some even dying from this very mistake. Can you imagine being so desperate that you actually try drinking seawater, thinking it might save you? A terrible, bitter reality for these pirates, but it was one of many lessons they had to learn the hard way. Okay, so drinking seawater was off the table, but how were pirates supposed to store enough fresh water to survive the long, treacherous sea voyages? They didn't have refrigerated storage units or coolers, just good old wooden barrels. And let's just say these weren't the most reliable options when it came to preserving precious water. Imagine a pirate ship with dozens of large, heavy barrels, which they humorously referred to as butts, stacked up in the hold, all designed to store water. Each barrel could hold about 50 gallons, which sounds like a lot at first, right? But here's a catch. Wood is porous. And when you combine that with the saltwater spray from the ocean, the humidity, and the heat, well, things go south pretty quickly. the water would sour and start tasting rancid. Kind of like if you left a glass of water out in the sun for days on end. And that's not even the worst of it. Over time, the water would turn putrid. Imagine you've been sailing for weeks with barely any fresh water, and then the water you do have turns foul and undrinkable. Pirates quickly realized that a barrel full of water wasn't much use if it made you sick. It wasn't just the taste, it was the bacteria. Wood, especially old barrels, is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and mold. That's what happened with their water supplies. The conditions on the ship, heat, moisture, and no real way to seal the barrels properly meant that the water in them would turn into a breeding ground for dangerous bacteria. In essence, it was like a toxic soup in these barrels. Not exactly what you're hoping to drink after a few days without a proper supply. And here's where things get a little gross. The pirates, not willing to waste what little fresh water they had, would still drink from the barrels even if it smelled bad. At the point where they were most desperate, they'd do anything to keep hydrated, no matter how awful the water was. The thirst was so severe that the pirate crews often had to make do with what they had, which wasn't much. Their survival instincts kicked in, and while it wasn't ideal, it was a reality they had to live with. They had to get creative though. You can only stretch things so far before you need to find a better way to store water. And that's exactly what the pirates started doing. They figured out that if they could somehow preserve the water longer, they might survive longer. When you're stuck at sea, days turn into weeks, and weeks into months. And with no sign of land, no hope of finding fresh water, desperation sets in. It's the kind of desperation that makes you forget all logic, all sense of survival, and pushes you to try anything to satisfy that gnawing thirst. Pirates didn't just wish for water. They needed it to live. When the water barrels started running dry, they didn't just sit there and wait for the ocean to provide. They started getting creative, really creative. That's when they start sneaking sips of seawater, convinced that just a little bit might quench their thirst. It never did. All it did was make everything worse. The body couldn't process the salt, so they end up getting even thirstier and more dehydrated, feeling the symptoms of hypernatremia, the technical term for salt poisoning. And let's be real, it's not a nice experience. You start getting cramps, your gut churns like you've swallowed a hurricane, and worst of all, you begin hallucinating. The sea, which was supposed to be your salvation, now becomes a nightmare. Some pirates even swore they could see fresh springs on the horizon, only to realize it was just their minds playing tricks on them. But it wasn't just a case of mistakes. This desperation would turn deadly. Crew, members, seeing the water running low, would start bickering. The tension would mount. Pirates fought over every last drop, pushing the camaraderie of the crew to the breaking point. When water got so scarce that there was barely enough for each man, mutiny became an ever-present threat. There's no pirate story without a good mutiny, and water shortages made the stakes higher. One wrong move, and the desperate crew could turn on each other quicker than you could say ahoy. And even as the pirates fought among themselves and struggled against the salt water in their bellies, their minds would be on the same thing: survival. They knew they had to hold it together, but at that point, every drop of water became a treasure more precious than gold. The thirst would consume them, and the line between sanity and madness would start to blur. It's a grim reminder of how human beings, pirates or not, will do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means fighting your best mate for the last sip of water in the barrel. Pirates didn't just fight for treasure. They fought for their lives, for the very thing that kept them going through endless days at sea. When you're running low on fresh water, it's time to get creative. And pirates were nothing if not resourceful. The sea was their home, but it didn't exactly offer up much in terms of hydration. So pirates turned to whatever they could to gather water, hoping for the best in a situation that got more dire with each passing day. The first idea, simple but effective, was rainwater. When a storm rolled in, pirates saw it as a gift from the heavens. They would scramble to collect every drop, using sails, old clothes, or anything they could lay their hands on to funnel the rain into barrels. Rainwater was a godsend, but it wasn't always a guarantee. Sometimes the skies would stay clear for weeks, and the pirates were left with nothing but salt water and dwindling supplies. So, whenever those clouds started rolling in, it was a mad dash to gather as much as they could. But even rainwater had its issues. The sails and tarps used to catch the water were often covered in salt water from the constant spray of the sea. So before they could catch rain, pirates had to clean their makeshift rain catchers, an exhausting and tedious process. And even when the rain came, it wasn't like they could sit back and relax. No, it took constant vigilance. A pirate had to keep watch over the rain catchers, ensuring the water didn't spill out or become contaminated by other sources. Every drop counted, and you could bet that pirates weren't about to let a single drop of rainwater slip through their fingers. In those moments, when the sea seemed so unforgiving and the thirst unbearable, the rain was like a cool drink of salvation. But rainwater wasn't the only trick up their sleeve. Pirates also looked for dew. It's a method that had been used by ancient civilizations, but pirates were smart enough to adapt it to their needs. They would soak pieces of cloth or leather in seawater, hang them up overnight in the humidity, and by morning, the moisture from the air would condense on the fabric. While it wasn't much, just a few cups of dew per cloth, it was better than nothing. It wasn't the kind of water you'd want to drink every day, but when you've been at sea for weeks and the thirst is starting to get to you, those few drops could mean the difference between life and death. It wasn't just about finding the water, it was about timing it right. Pirates had to learn how to read the weather, to predict when they might get lucky with rain or dew. They had to anticipate the conditions of the sea, how much moisture was in the air, and how long they had before the next storm. But as any pirate knows, the weather is an unpredictable beast. Even when you think you have a handle on it, the ocean can flip the script and leave you stranded without any fresh water to drink. Still, pirates kept trying. They made the best of what they had. They didn't rely on just one method of water collection. They tried to combine every trick they knew, squeezing out every last drop of moisture, hoping that their resourcefulness would be enough to get them through another week or month at sea. It was a constant battle, but pirates were nothing if not persistent. So let's say the pirates have managed to collect some fresh rainwater or dew, but there's still a massive problem, keeping that water from going bad. It's not like you could just pop a lid on a barrel and call it a day. Water on a pirate ship had a shelf life, and that shelf life wasn't long. You see, the problem wasn't just the barrels themselves, which were already a nightmare for storage. Even when the water wasn't tainted by the wood or salt, it had a habit of spoiling. You might think, well, water's just water, right? How hard could it be to keep it fresh? But in the hot, damp, and sometimes downright filthy conditions of a pirate ship, keeping that precious supply of water clean was like trying to keep a fresh fruit basket from rotting in the sunday. Water was spoiled in two main ways: bacteria and stagnation. First off, let's talk about the bacteria issue. We're not talking about some small-scale contamination here. No, pirates were dealing with serious bacterial growth in their water barrels. The warm, dark, and moist environment of a ship was ideal for bacteria to multiply, and those little critters would turn the water from life-sustaining liquid into a nasty, disease-ridden concoction. If the water didn't turn into some gross, slimy mess, it would often develop an unpleasant odor, making it even harder to convince yourself to take a sip. As any pirate knows, taking a drink of foul water was a one-way ticket to stomach cramps and worse. And then there was the problem of stagnation. If water just sat there in the barrel for too long, it would go flat and stale, tasting like the bottom of an old, musty closet. It's like leaving the bottle of water open for weeks. It'll lose all the refreshing qualities and just taste off. Pirates didn't have the luxury of choosing how fresh their water tasted, so they'd often have to drink whatever was left, even if it tasted like old wood or stale ale. Pirates tried to combat these issues in several ways. Some would rotate their water supply, moving it between barrels in the hopes that it wouldn't get too stagnant. Others would add bits of cloth or sand to the barrels, hoping it would filter out the impurities and bacteria. But none of these methods were foolproof. Eventually, pirates came to realize they needed something better. They couldn't afford to keep wasting their precious water supplies because, well, water was life. So, in typical pirate fashion, they started brainstorming. And that's when they came up with a solution that, at first glance, might seem a little strange. But it was exactly what they needed. Now, it wasn't like the pirates had a magic wand to fix their water problems, but they were inventive. It's not like they had a PhD in water preservation, but they had something better: desperation and the willingness to try anything. This particular solution came from a mix of trial, error, and, let's be honest, a touch of drunken inspiration. One day, a pirate probably got bored and thought, what if we just set the inside of these barrels on fire? Well, that's exactly what they did. They started burning the inside of the barrels. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, let's just set fire to the very thing that's supposed to keep us hydrated. But it worked. Charring the inside of the barrels did something magical. It created a layer of charred wood that acted as a natural filter. This layer didn't just make the barrels look cool, it kept the water fresher for longer and prevented bacterial growth. The charred wood essentially absorbed the impurities and helped keep the water clean. Now, this wasn't a perfect solution. I mean, it's still a barrel at the end of the day. The water wasn't going to stay fresh forever, and it was still exposed to the same environmental conditions that had been causing problems all along. But it was better than what they had before. The process was simple enough. They would set the barrels on fire, let the inside burn, then let them cool before filling them with water again. The charring helped preserve the water and made it taste a little less like death in the barrel. And honestly, this wasn't a completely new concept. The idea of charring wood for preservation dates back centuries. It's a practice that evolved into what we now know as activated charcoal, a material we use today to filter air and water. But for pirates, this was a kind of eureka moment that might have happened after one too many cups of rum. The pirates didn't have science textbooks to tell them how to do it, but they figured it out on their own, and it helped them stay alive just a little bit longer. It's also worth noting that burning the barrels wasn't a quick fix. Pirates had to keep an eye on the barrels, maintaining the fire at just the right temperature to avoid setting the entire ship on fire. But hey, a few singed barrels were a small price to pay for fresh water, right? Once the pirates had perfected their technique of charring barrels, they still had a problem. Even the freshest water could get contaminated over time. The real question became, how do we keep this water from spoiling too quickly? The answer, surprisingly, came from something that had been around for centuries: silver. Yes, you heard me right. Silver. Now, before you think pirates were just trying to fancy up their water supply with some shiny treasure, there was actually a method to their madness. Silver, as it turns out, has some pretty remarkable antibacterial properties. While the pirates didn't have microscopes or any fancy lab equipment to confirm this, they noticed that when silver coins were tossed into the barrels, the water stayed fresher, tasted better, and lasted longer without going bad. So what did they do? They threw more silver into the barrels. In fact, the practice became so common that it was almost a pirate tradition. The beauty of silver is in its natural properties. It doesn't just sit there looking pretty. It actively kills bacteria and prevents harmful microbes from multiplying in the water. Silver ions can disrupt the cell walls of bacteria, stopping them from spreading and turning the water into a breeding ground for sickness. So, by tossing a few coins or bits of silver into their barrels, pirates were essentially creating a primitive but effective filtration system. And let's face it, the pirates didn't mind the added bonus of having a little extra treasure floating around in the water. A bit of silver here, a few coins there, who knew it would double as a water purifier? But while it might sound like superstition to us today, it was actually a stroke of genius. There's something undeniably pirate about figuring out that treasure something they were after in the first place could actually save their lives. It wasn't just for hoarding, it was a tool of survival, tucked away in their water barrels, keeping them hydrated, healthy, and ready for the next adventure. Of course, modern science has since confirmed that silver does have these antibacterial properties. But back then, pirates had no idea about ions and microbes. They just knew it worked. And if you think about it, silver coins in the water barrels might have been one of the most piratey things imaginable. You've got your treasure, you've got your survival, and you've got a nice little side bonus of keeping your water drinkable for a little longer. Talk about making the most of what you've got. Okay, so we've got the silver coins keeping things fresh, the charred barrels doing their job, and the occasional rainwater catch. But there's always more room for creativity when you're a pirate, especially when you're trying to keep a dwindling water supply safe from spoiling. Enter alcohol and vinegar. Yes, you heard me right. These weren't just for getting the crew good and drunk after a successful raid. Pirates, ever resourceful, began to realize that the alcohol they had on hand could actually help preserve the water. You know, the rum and wine they were always toting around in barrels? They weren't just for drinking. These boozy liquids acted as natural preservatives. Alcohol, especially in the amounts pirates typically used, slows down bacterial growth. You wouldn't find pirates throwing a party with their rum supply in mind, but the reality was that a splash of rum in the water barrels helped extend the shelf life of the water and kept the bacteria at bay. But that's not all. Pirates weren't just relying on rum to keep their water from going sour, they started experimenting with vinegar too. Vinegar, thanks to its acidity, had the ability to prevent spoilage and kill off germs. It's pretty much the pirate version of an ancient disinfectant. And considering that pirates didn't have access to modern cleaning supplies, vinegar was a handy option. It wasn't as powerful as modern sanitizers, but it could definitely buy some time. The real genius of these methods was in their simplicity. Pirates didn't have to make anything complicated or fancy. They just used what they had on hand. A bit of alcohol here, some vinegar there, and voila, the water lasted longer without turning into a breeding ground for illness. Sure, it wasn't ideal. The water didn't taste exactly like spring water, but it was drinkable, and that was the goal. Pirates weren't after a 5-star hydration experience, they just wanted something that wouldn't kill them. Now, don't get me wrong, adding alcohol and vinegar to the water wasn't a long-term solution. It wasn't a foolproof method, and there was always the risk of the water still going bad or becoming unpalatable. But in a world where you're stuck at sea with limited supplies, any little trick to make the water last a little longer was worth it. And let's not forget the fact that pirates being pirates were also sneaky. It wasn't just about survival, it was about keeping up appearances too. Who wanted to drink sour, murky water when you could add a splash of rum and at least pretend it wasn't so bad? It wasn't about quality. It was about making do with what you had, and pirates were masters of making do. Now, we've covered some of the ways pirates try to preserve water, but what happens when you've done everything you can and that water still tastes like it's been sitting in the bottom of a moldy barrel for months? Spoiler alert, it probably has. But pirates, being the resourceful and surprisingly inventive lot they were, didn't just have to deal with nasty tasting water. They found ways to make it a little more bearable. And that's where spices and citrus came into play. Here's the thing, if you've ever had to drink water that's gone bad, it's not just about the taste. It's the smell, the texture, and the overall feeling of, oh my gosh, I really don't want to do this. But pirates weren't about to let a little thing like stale water ruin their day or their voyage. Instead of just accepting the bad water, they decided to fight back with some flavor. The pirates, knowing the value of spices from their travels and trade routes, started adding whatever they had in their stores, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, or even bits of dry citrus peels into their water barrels. And while the combination might sound a bit odd to us now, these spices were more than just a way to mask the flavor of the water. They actually had practical benefits too. Cinnamon and cloves, for instance, aren't just for holiday pies, they're natural preservatives. They have antimicrobial properties. So by tossing them into the barrels, pirates were, in effect, doing more than just making the water taste better. They were helping to keep it from turning completely foul. A little cinnamon could also add a bit of warmth and spice to a drink that otherwise might have tasted like old boots. The scent of cloves in the air was a tiny comfort in a world full of desperation. As for the citrus peels, well, they were more than just a fruity add-in. Pirates understood that vitamin C was important to prevent scurvy, and they had to get their hands on whatever they could to ward off that dreaded disease. Citrus was a precious commodity on a pirate ship, but if the pirates were lucky enough to have a few leftover fruits, they tossed the peels into the water barrels. It didn't just help with taste, it was a survival tactic in its own right. The little boost of vitamin C kept their gums from bleeding and their bodies from falling apart in the midst of dehydration. But let's be real for a second. This water didn't taste good. It didn't taste like a refreshing glass of lemon water you might enjoy on a hot day. It tasted like water that had been sitting in a barrel for too long, flavored with whatever spices and citrus you could scrape together. It wasn't ideal, but it was something a necessary evil in the struggle to stay hydrated. If you're stuck at sea, your standards for a refreshing drink drop pretty quickly. and pirates were all too familiar with that reality. They didn't have a choice. They drank what they could, and these little tricks made the whole process a little less soul-crushing. As a pirate, you had to make it through the day. A little spice here, a splash of citrus there. It wasn't a luxury. It was a matter of survival. Now, while all these creative methods for preserving and improving the water supply were great, pirates didn't have the luxury of living on rainwater, dew, or silver coins forever. The reality was that they spent more time on the sea than on land, and the ocean, as you might expect, was not exactly a freshwater reservoir. So, what did they do when their stores ran out and there was no land in sight? They looked at the sea, which, while not a freshwater oasis, was still water. The only problem was that salty little detail: enter distillation. This wasn't exactly a new idea, it's been around for centuries, but pirates weren't exactly known for their scientific breakthroughs, so they had to make it work with what they had. The basic idea was simple: take seawater, boil it, and collect the steam. That steam is pure, salt-free, fresh water. The process itself was relatively straightforward, but the conditions aboard a pirate ship were anything but ideal. First off, pirates had to figure out how to boil the seawater, and that's when things got tricky. A pirate ship wasn't exactly equipped with the luxury of a fully stocked kitchen or a distillation laboratory, so they had to get creative with their setup. They would repurpose whatever they could find: old metal pans, copper pipes, sometimes even melted down coins or stolen jewelry. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Once they managed to get a fire going, which, as you can imagine, was a pretty risky endeavor on the wooden ship, they would heat the seawater in the metal pans. The steam would rise, cool down, and then condense into fresh, drinkable water. Sounds like a dream, right? And for the pirates who had the resources to build such a system, it was. But, as you can guess, the process wasn't without its issues. For one, pirates didn't have an endless supply of firewood. They had to burn whatever they could find: old planks, ropes, boots, even pieces of their ship's furniture. The smell must have been absolutely awful, but it was a necessary sacrifice for the sake of fresh water. Plus, burning wood for the distillation process meant that they were slowly chipping away at their already limited supply of resources. Every piece of wood they used to boil the water couldn't be used for repairs or cooking, making the pirates even more vulnerable to the elements. But it wasn't just the wood issue. Distilling seawater wasn't quick. The amount of fresh water produced by these makeshift rigs was minimal, at best just a few cups per hour. So, while pirates could distill water, it was far from a reliable, sustainable source. And when you've got a crew of 20 or 30 thirsty pirates, a few cups of water a day is not going to cut it. Still, pirates were nothing if not resourceful. Even with these limitations, the distillation process gave them another option in their fight for survival. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than nothing. It became one of the many methods they would rely on, alongside rainwater collection and the silver coins floating in their barrels. And as long as they had a fire to stoke and a bit of luck on their side, they could keep the distillation going. In a way, distillation was a symbol of the pirate spirit, taking what's around you, turning it into something useful, and doing whatever it takes to survive. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it worked. And for pirates, that was enough. Let's be real for a second. As clever as the pirates were with their distillation rigs, it wasn't a perfect solution. Sure, the idea of turning seawater into fresh water sounds like a dream come true. But as with most things on a pirate ship, it wasn't as smooth as it looked from the outside. Distilling water was a slow, labor-intensive process, and pirates quickly realized that it wasn't the ultimate game changer they had hoped for. First of all, the amount of water produced was minimal at best. Even with a distillation system running 24/7, you weren't looking at gallons of fresh water, more like a few cups an hour. That's not gonna get a crew of 30 or more pirates very far, especially when you're sailing for weeks or months on end. A pirate ship might have a distillation setup, but it wasn't like they could just churn out fresh water like it was some sort of high-tech machine. They were essentially boiling seawater, catching the steam, and waiting for it to condense. Each drop was precious, but it wasn't going to keep everyone hydrated for long. And let's not even get started on the constant fuel problem. To keep that distillation rig running, pirates needed heat, lots of it. But they didn't have an unlimited supply of wood. Every piece they burned for the distillation process was one less piece they could use for cooking, repairing the ship, or defending themselves from enemies. Burning wood wasn't just a method for distilling water, it was a resource drain. So, pirates had to balance their need for fresh water with their need for firewood. And that's no easy feat when you're stuck in the middle of the ocean with no landing site. What's more, pirates weren't exactly distilling water in pristine conditions. They were using repurposed copper pipes, melted down coins, and broken bits of old metal. It wasn't the kind of setup you'd find in a modern distillery. The pirate distillation systems were rudimentary at best, and that meant they weren't always very efficient. Sometimes they have to improvise with whatever materials they could find, like a patched up old pot or a piece of spare rope. It worked, but it was far from ideal. And then there were the weather conditions. Have you ever tried to keep a fire going in a storm? It's not easy. Pirate ships didn't have a reliable heat source, and the seas weren't exactly friendly to fire. If it rained or the seas got rough, the pirates would struggle to keep the fire lit. A stable fire was the key to distilling water, but the unpredictable nature of the ocean made it a huge challenge. Pirates often found themselves fighting against the elements just to keep their distillation process going. Still, despite all these challenges, distillation was a vital backup method. It wasn't perfect, but when the rainwater had dried up and the barrels were nearly empty, pirates could still turn to the distillation rig as a last resort. It didn't guarantee survival, but it was a way to keep going one cup of water at a time. And let's be clear, pirates didn't mind the struggle. They thrived on adversity. Even when things weren't going their way, they adapted, they fought back, and they survived. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective enough to get them through the most trying moments at sea. And in a world full of unpredictable weather, storms, and dwindling supplies, that little bit of ingenuity made all the difference. In the end, it wasn't the treasure or the sword fights that defined the pirate life, it was survival. The pirates had their fair share of rum and riches, but none of that mattered when you're staring dehydration in the face, fighting to stay alive with nothing but a few chests of supplies and the vast, unforgiving seas surrounding you. What kept pirates alive, beyond their brawn and cunning, was their endless resourcefulness. They didn't wait for problems to fix themselves, they found solutions, even if it meant getting a little creative. Take their battle for freshwater, for instance. Over time, pirates had honed a whole arsenal of techniques to stay hydrated. The distillation methods, the silver coins, the vinegar and alcohol, the spices, and the citrus peels, they all contributed to their survival. But each solution had its limits. Pirates didn't have the luxury of a one-size-fits-all solution. They were constantly adapting to their surroundings, switching between rainwater, dew, and any other method they could think of, all while making do with whatever scraps were on hand. But pirates didn't just rely on their ingenuity for water, they applied it to everything. They were survivors in a world where the sea was their enemy and their only companion. They turned every challenge into an opportunity. They didn't sit back and wait for the wind to blow in their favor. They made their own luck. Their ability to adapt and innovate was perhaps their greatest strength. If they didn't have a proper water barrel, they found a way to make do with something else. If the distillation rig wasn't working as expected, they would tinker with it, repurpose a few more materials, and try again. In the world of pirates, there was no room for weakness. The sea didn't care if you were a good person or a terrible one, it treated everyone the same. But pirates understood that the sea was just another opponent, one that requires strategy, persistence, and a touch of madness. And that's exactly what they brought to the table. If one method of water collection failed, they simply moved on to the next. The pirates weren't just fighting dehydration, they were fighting everything. The weather, starvation, sickness, and even mutiny. They had to be creative, quick thinking, and ruthless in their will to survive. There was no manual for pirate survival, no playbook. But the pirates wrote their own guide through the art of trial and error. Sometimes they would fail, sometimes they would lose more crew members to the sea or to their own desperation. But each failure only taught them how to try harder the next time. Each day at sea was a battle for survival, and every pirate knew that they couldn't rest on their laurels. They had to stay one step ahead of nature, and sometimes that meant doing things that others might consider strange or even crazy. At the end of the day, survival wasn't guaranteed. Pirates knew that as well as anyone, but they had the drive to keep pushing, no matter how tough it got. And that's why, even though their lives were constantly on the edge of danger, they managed to outlast so many others. Their resourcefulness made them not just pirates, but survivors. Through every drought, every storm, and every desperate thirst, they kept going. It wasn't just about the treasure or the thrill of the chase. It was about outlasting the impossible and winning against nature's fiercest challenges. So, next time you find yourself facing a tough situation, maybe you're stuck in a traffic jam or struggling with a project, just remember, the pirates didn't back down when things got rough. They